Welcome to the fourth episode in a Legendarium series about the history of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Today we'll be talking about the Kingdom of Kent. We'll be discussing the Fall of Vortigern, believed to be the last of the Romano-British strongmen. We'll talk about the first kings of Kent, Hengist and his son Oisc. We'll talk about how St. Augustine converted King Ethelbert of Kent to Christianity and the days of peace that followed. Then we'll talk about the decline of Kentish power in the wake of the plague of 664, the revival the kingdom enjoyed under King Wihtred, and its eventual conquest by the Mercians, and then the Kingdom of Wessex. As Roman power waned through the 300s, the defenses at Hadrian's Wall began to fall apart. In AD 367, the Picts crossed the wall and raided the northern part of Roman Britannia. Irish raiders soon followed from across the Irish Sea. During these troubled years, the legions dotted the coasts with forts and watchtowers to keep an eye out for invaders. And some of the men manning these forts and watchtowers would have been Germans, newly arrived in Kent, helping to fight off invaders with Roman arms, armor, and military tactics in exchange for land in the area. And these foederati would have remained after the legions abandoned Britannia in the year 410 AD. Not long after, the Romano-British appointed a man named Vortigern as their national leader. Vortigern may have been the son-in-law of a former emperor named Magnus Maximus, who had used Roman Britannia as his base. Whether of imperial lineage or not, Vortigern imported defenders from the continent, granting a Germanic leader named Hengist land centered on the island of Thanet in exchange for driving off the Picts and the Irish. However, this gambit ended in disaster when the Germans realized how weak the Romano-Britons were. According to tradition, they turned on their hosts and paymasters during peace talks at Stonehenge. Both sides had laid down their weapons before the meeting, but the Saxons hid long knives called seaxes in their boots. These long blades were often at the center of Saxon lore, with tales of fighting men who did battle with swords possessed by spirits or demons. And the Saxons must have seemed demonic indeed when they ripped the knives from their boots and slaughtered 460 of the Romano-British leading men. Only Vortigern was left alive, so that he could sign over most of what would become the Kingdom of Kent to Hengist. And so the first of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England was created. The people we call the Anglo-Saxons were a mix of nations from northern Germany, Denmark, and Holland. They included not only Angles and Saxons, but Jutes, Batavians, Franks, and Frisians. Indeed, the original settlers of Kent were themselves an ethnic mix, including Jutes, Angles, and Saxons. After the success of Hengist in conquering Kent, more of them crossed the North Sea to grab a piece of the Roman province of Britannia as the empire collapsed. I already covered the events surrounding the rise of Hengist of Kent in an earlier video, and if you want to see it, please use the link in the description below. Hengist is said to have ruled from 455 AD to 488 AD, with a reign of 33 years being a remarkably long time in an age when few men lived past the age of 40. The ruling dynasty of Kent, however, based their claim to the throne upon Hengist's son and successor Oisc, who ruled from 488 to 512. And if that is true, then he may have fought at the Battle of Badon Hill in AD 496, a defeat for the Anglo-Saxon nations, which slowed their expansion into England for a generation. During his reign, and perhaps because of losses suffered at Badon Hill, King Oisc focused on consolidating Anglo-Saxon control of Kent rather than expanding it. And he must have succeeded because the ruling dynasty would call themselves the Oscingas, and base their claim to the throne based on their descent from King Oisc. Little is known about King Octa, the son of King Oisc, but his grandson, King Ormenric, was involved in the conquest of Essex, where he likely established one of his followers or kinsmen as the King of Essex. Indeed, Kent and Essex would remain close allies for over 100 years, with the royal families of the two kingdoms often intermarrying. However, the Kingdom of Kent likely reached its peak under King Ethelbert. Ethelbert married a Merovingian princess named Bertha, a woman of great learning who corresponded with Pope Gregory the Great himself. Though Ethelbert was a pagan, he allowed his Christian wife to build a wooden chapel, and according to legend, that wooden chapel would become the basis for Canterbury Cathedral. Bertha's entourage included a Frankish priest who served as her confessor, and in part because of her influence, St. Augustine was brought into Kent in AD 597. Pope Gregory likely sent a mission to Kent specifically because it was then paramount among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, with Ethelbert being elected Bretwalda or High King by the other Anglo-Saxon kings. And in a great success for the Roman Church, St. Augustine converted King Ethelbert to Roman Christianity, the first Anglo-Saxon king to do so. However, one of the legacies of the Anglo-Saxon conquest was an England divided by religion, not just between those who remained pagan and those who converted to Christianity, but between two different creeds of Christianity. As the Roman Empire Christianized in its final years, most of the Romano-Britons had already been evangelized. However, the Anglo-Saxon invaders were thoroughgoing pagans, worshipping Woden and Thor and carrying out large-scale animal sacrifices every November. Cut off from the church in Rome by their pagan rulers, Romano-British Christians turned to Irish missionaries for guidance, who practiced a distinct branch of Christianity called Celtic Christianity, which gave leadership to abbots rather than bishops. And since Ethelbert had converted to Roman Christianity, this created a second religious divide within England. In 603, King Ethelbert held a synod between representatives of the Roman and Celtic churches at a place the Venerable Bede named as St. Augustine's Oak. The meeting was the beginning of several aimed at reaching an agreement on calculating the date of Easter and how to evangelize those who remained pagan. Apparently, St. Augustine's haughty manner did not endear him to the Celtic Christians, and the meeting ended with no agreement. While the Roman Church in England recovered from this setback, King Ethelbert's prestige never did, and after the failure of these early synods, Kent began a slow but steady decline in importance. However, the Roman evangelization of Kent proceeded quickly. The churches of Kent were often linked to holy wells, springs, and female saints, themselves linked by roads that predated the Roman Empire. This tells us that the Roman missionaries likely Christianized pagan worship sites, turning sacred groves into churches. However, there are other signs of continuity from the Saxon era. When Germanic settlers first arrived, some established themselves as freeholders following the custom of their home country. And because of this, the land of Kent became marked by family-held farmsteads and hamlets rather than the manorial communities led by lords that were seen elsewhere, both in England and the continent. Though Ethelbert's successor Eadbald lost the title of Bretwalda to the kings of what would become Northumbria, his reign saw other successes. Like his father, he took a Frankish wife, and made efforts to bring the Kentish church more in line with the Roman rather than Celtic teachings, in part to endear himself to the Merovingians. In addition, he became the first Anglo-Saxon king to strike gold shillings in his own name, sometime in the 620s, showing that town life and trade began to recover during his reign. And even though the title of Bretwalda was lost, the northern Bretwaldas treated the kings of Kent as peers, an extraordinary gesture for a high king. This was because of Kent's unique standing as both the oldest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and being the site of the Archbishopric of Canterbury, they were also the center of Roman Christianity in England. Because of this great prestige, the kings of Kent were able to establish abbeys outside their own borders. However, this changed after the Great Plague of 664, a fierce pestilence that left whole monasteries emptied and villages sometimes peopled by only a few survivors. Kent lost not one but two kings to outbreaks of the plague, and the royal house would never be as stable or prestigious again. In the aftermath of the plague, a man named Egbert seized the throne after murdering two of his own family members, Ethelred and Ethelbert. This did great damage to the moral authority of the Hengist dynasty. Further damage was done when Egbert suddenly died and a new candidate named Lothair agreed to share power with his nephew Edric. However, Lothair forgot his promise, and his nephew Edric went into exile in Sussex. There, Edric promised the kings of Sussex a border province called Hastings if they helped him to regain the throne. And while the kings of Sussex did kill Lothair in battle and install Edric on the throne, the young king ruled for only a year before being murdered by rebels. After 200 years of peaceful rule, the Kingdom of Kent, the oldest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, collapsed into anarchy. And the Mercians to the north were happy to take advantage, sweeping through Kent, looting farm fields and homesteads and burning what they could not carry away. A terrible famine gripped Kent. People killed their draft animals and ate their seed corn. Dogs and cats vanished from the villages. Elderly family members starved themselves so the children would have enough to eat. Thus it must have come as a great relief to the men of Kent when a prince of the Hengist dynasty, Wihtred, led a rebellion against the Mercian puppet kings in 693. They threw out the foreign vassals, and King Wihtred reigned an independent Kent from 690 to 725. King Wihtred wrote a great many laws, likely using the Christian clergy to author and publish them. Wihtred's laws sought to govern Kentish society in accordance with Christian teachings, giving much attention to sacred oaths and marriage law, along with bans on pagan worship and animal sacrifices. Upon his death, Wihtred made his eldest son Ethelbert II paramount king of Kent, with the two younger sons as sub-kings. And this arrangement allowed for another 2 generations of peace, which endured until the 760s, when the Hengist line appears to have died out, at least on the male line, with no heirs ready to take the throne. The leading nobles of Kent hoped to import sons of the Wessex royal family to serve as their king and help hold the line against Mercia. However, King Offa of Mercia had other ideas, and he maneuvered to install his candidates on the Kentish throne. He chose a man named Egbert II, likely descended from the female line of the Hengist dynasty, to serve as his puppet king. Revolt broke out against the Mercian puppet in 774 and lasted for 9 years, until the Mercians invaded and crushed the revolt. In a parallel to William the Conqueror 300 years later, Offa's men seized the land of Kentish nobles and reduced them to poverty. To punish the Archbishop of Canterbury for supporting the Kentish revolt, Offa founded a new archbishopric at Lichfield. As English and Frankish nobles imported Byzantine art to show good taste, Offa imported Byzantine punishments to show Kentish nobles what happened to those who crossed him. And Offa chastised the Kentish royal who led the revolt, Ethelbert, by burning out his eyes and chopping off his hands before leaving him to rot in prison. The toiling peasants, however, fared little better. Mercians showed no mercy, taking what they could and burning the rest. As before, the peasants were reduced to eating bark and moss to survive, with the most desperate abandoning their children in the woods to be eaten by wolves so they would have enough to eat. There were even rumors of men digging up the dead to eat their flesh, and memories of this terrible famine and brutal treatment lingered until 825, when King Egbert of Wessex drove the Mercians from Kent. This victory was especially sweet for Kent, as King Egbert claimed descent from a Kentish prince who sought refuge in Wessex and married into the royal family. And when King Egbert arrived at Canterbury in a royal visit, he was greeted by cheering crowds, and thus Kent became part of what would become a united England. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, please let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope you have a great day.